Welcome to the Argue With Me podcast. This is the inaugural episode. I'll be your host, Jerry Bordeaux. This is my podcast. I look forward to introducing you to some of my ideas, but also bringing you ideas from other people who have interesting things to say. And that really is the point of this podcast, is not to stick on one topic. I don't want to pigeonhole it as a philosophy podcast or a science podcast or a political podcast of some kind. It's just meant to be interesting. So hopefully I achieve that goal. And to that end, I am more than delighted to say that Dr. Michael Huemer, my favorite philosopher, without a doubt, agreed to be my first guest. And the topic that I chose, though there are so many things that I wanted to talk to him about, was epistemology. I figured the natural starting point for any podcast that's supposed to be informative and entertaining might be to figure out how we know anything to begin with. I think that we did a good job of covering a lot of ground in only a little over an hour. There are a few side tracks, diversions, or digressions, whatever you'd like to call them, throughout the conversation, but I think that it adds some flavor, and hopefully a few of those will give me reason to have Mike back on again, because I like talking with Mike. I think he's a very reasonable guy, and he's just full of interesting ideas. So with that, I give you my discussion with Dr. Michael Huemer. All right. So thank you, Mike, for agreeing to come on the Argue With Me podcast. This is my inaugural episode, and I can't think of a better guest. So for those who don't know, Dr. Huemer here is the professor of philosophy at the University of Colorado Boulder, and my favorite philosopher for sure. So I'm sorry if I don't want to embarrass you, Mike, but I'm going to gush for just a little bit of time here. Yeah, you're fine with it. I frequently, no, I shouldn't say frequently, I sometimes don't agree with conclusions that you come up with, Mike, but I always appreciate them, and I always learn when I either listen to you or read your books. So I think out of everybody that I've sort of followed in my life, as far as learning and yeah, any sort of research into anything that interests me goes, I think you're the most likely candidate to push me off of you. So yeah, so with that sort of with that sort of out of the way, what we are talking about today, I figured the first episode would be a logical point to figure out how do we know anything, right? So this is not strictly a philosophy podcast, although I do plan on doing a good amount of that, but any topic that I talk about, I mean, how do we know anything about it anyway? How can we ever be sure that we know, or can we be sure, and that sort of thing? And so I went through your book. I'm going to try to hold it up without affecting the fake background. Understanding Knowledge. Oh, there you go. Thank you. Which is an excellent book. It's very accessible to a reader who I think doesn't, anyone who has a strong grasp of the English language can get through this book without knowing anything about epistemology prior, I think would be fair to say. And so I think maybe the first question I have for you then, Mike, is, since this is a book essentially about epistemology, what is epistemology?
Well, it's a branch of philosophy that addresses philosophical questions about knowledge. So you have questions like, what is knowledge, and how do we know the things that we know? And do we in fact know the things that we usually think we know, and that sort of thing? Related questions like, what's the justification for our beliefs? How are our beliefs justified?
Right. So when you say things that we know, right? So I was in an examination the other day, And I don't mean I was taking a test. I mean I was being examined by a bunch of lawyers over something to do with my job. Um, not in trouble, just had to give some evidence.
Yeah.
This is similar, very similar. You can picture in the U.S. I'm Canadian, and so it's more likely to be called an examination here. But in the U.S., it's like a deposition, right? So it's not outside of court. Lawyers are asking you questions, and they kept asking me if I had any knowledge, information, or belief about XYZ subject. And I was in the middle of reading your book, and I kept trying to not chuckle every time they asked me knowledge, information, or belief because I couldn't even really keep straight what those words meant in my head anymore.
Yeah.
So, what
I
is
suppose
knowledge?
I suppose they said that because they didn't want some asshole to later say that, oh, well, I didn't know, so I didn't say anything.
Yeah, I
So,
wasn't 100% certain.
yeah.
Not, but
So,
at the other side of it, though, a belief. I mean, you want me to tell you what I believe? Wow, this is going to be interesting. I can say whatever I want then, I guess, if I really believe it.
yeah,
So
well,
what?
only what you really believe, though, so
Yeah,
you can't
yeah,
lie. But I mean, it's kind of redundant, right? Because they could have just said, do you have any belief? Because
right.
you can't have information without having a belief, right? And
Yeah,
you can't have knowledge without having the belief. So,
yeah,
okay. And by the way, everything that you say is what you believe anyway. So just like, tell us anything about X, whatever. Um, there's no agreement among epistemologists on the definition of knowledge. There's no accepted definition. Now, you might think that that's an amazing problem for the whole field, but that is, of course, the case for every field. As a matter of fact, as far as philosophers are concerned, virtually nothing has ever been defined. And there's an exception for the field of mathematics where they define a lot of terms, right? Although, I mean, they define a lot of things, but largely because they just make up a word and just stipulate that it means what they say, right?
yeah.
Um, but outside of that, there are almost no definitions that would be accepted by philosophical standards. Okay. Now that doesn't mean that there's nothing that could be said about the nature of knowledge, right? It just means like we haven't found the complete, necessary, and sufficient conditions across all possible worlds, right? That there are no counterexamples to and no objections to. Okay. Right. But what could be said is, well, it's generally agreed that in order to know something, you have to at least believe it. Okay. So, like, you don't know that it's raining if you don't even believe that it's raining. And secondly, it's got to be true. So, you don't know that it's raining if it isn't raining. And, okay. And then what else do you have to have? Many people say, well, you also have to have justification. The belief has to be justified, meaning something like you've got good enough reason to think that. Um, Okay. And then, it's generally thought that, well, if you have that, you're going to need at least some fourth condition. And then there's no agreement on what the fourth condition is. Right. But, like one idea is, well, you have to have no defeaters to the belief, which I think is, pretty good. That takes us pretty close to a complete definition, which is to say a defeater is some additional piece of information, which in this case, you don't, in fact, know, but if you added it to your beliefs, it would result in your no longer having justification for the thing that you believe.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So, okay, well, that's a lot of ground you covered really quickly there. So, would it, one thing I love about your book, and it's not just this one, it's all of your books. The way you write is actually it's very much just the way the way you speak, which is wonderful, because it makes it more accessible. But you'll say things like, "This word means something like," and then you'll explain it through either examples or counterexamples or that type of thing, which I guess is just always a nod to A, nobody agrees on definitions for anything, and B, like let's not waste time being pedantic. We kind of know what I mean, so let's move on,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
so I always appreciate that, and I think so. Maybe would it be fair to say the most common definition of knowledge is justified true belief? And we're always talking about something like that when we're talking about this
Well,
topic, or
yeah. Well, so that was said to be the traditional definition of knowledge before 1963, when somebody, wrote a famous article rebutting it. Um, so like nobody would say that that is the definition of knowledge, but a lot of people would say that that's close to what knowledge is, and you need some fourth condition, right? And then sort of like you get increasingly complicated cases. Okay. So that, justified true belief kind of covers most cases, but there's some unusual cases where you have a justified true belief and it's not knowledge. And so then you can add in something like the diffuser. Okay, there's some people who think you don't even need justification. So
Right.
like, you just need to have a reliable belief forming mechanism. And you might think like, what, it's kind of weird. Like, why would you not need justification? But think about things like when your dog is chasing a squirrel or something and the squirrel goes up the tree and, the dog knows that the squirrel is in the tree. Okay, but does the dog have justification for his belief? I mean, yeah, maybe he does, but it's sort of like, if you ask the dog, he can't justify it. Right?
Well,
Like,
that's
you give
interesting.
reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I without getting into it very much, I have a psychology background from university, and there are so many things that our brains, animal brains, just like the dog, um, will act upon or act like something is true, or even retain information about that. There's no justification like that could be offered, right? I mean, so for example, procedural memory, right? Like I if someone can play like I can play the guitar, I can do something with my hands. I don't think about it when I'm doing it. Something about me knows some information about playing guitar. Um, but
Yeah.
I don't know if I'd call that knowledge or not. Maybe my ability to explain that information would be knowledge. What do you think about
Oh, yeah.
that type of
I
thing?
mean, like people philosophers like to distinguish knowing how from knowing that. So you have know how, um, procedural knowledge or something like that, but you don't have propositional knowledge. So like you don't know the set of propositions that would accurately describe what you're doing.
Right. So like the
And
dog.
most of epistemology is generally about propositional knowledge.
Yeah.
Why I don't know. I mean, knowing how is also interesting. I don't know why, but we mostly focus on propositional knowledge.
It's just then what made me think of this is I remember reading from your book that, like you said, some people think that if you just have a reliable way of finding the truth, it's whatever
Yeah,
you think is justified. But then, I mean, that's sort of the dog could have a reliable way of finding the truth, and then all
yeah,
of a sudden, the squirrel in the tree becomes
yeah,
knowledge under certain
yeah.
definitions of it, right? Like it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, and that is in fact the point, because like in ordinary language, we would say the dog knows that the squirrel is in the tree. So you kind
right.
of want that to come out true. So you want a definition that allows that. I guess I think, well, I think that wasn't such a great example, because I think the dog does have a justification, which is that he saw the squirrel. Like, even though he wouldn't be able to articulate it.
Yeah.
But okay, so you can think of cases where I know it's hard to say what my justification is. So like, okay, I think that the Battle of Hastings took place in 1066. And okay, so somebody asked me, what's your justification for that? And I'm like, I don't know. I learned that sometime. That's not much of a justification. Well, like, how did you learn it? And I don't know. I don't know how I learned that. I mean, I know somebody told me that. I don't know who told me. And I think multiple people have probably told me that. I don't know how many
Right.
or when or who it was. So that's not a great, doesn't sound like a great justification. And so you might think, maybe I count as knowing that, even though I can't give much of a justification. And it seems like maybe the reason I know it is just that I'm reliable about it or something.
Yeah. Yeah. It becomes sort of a mess, I think, though, when it's like, okay, is it a reliable way of knowing this? Because then I think you're just pushing back the problem one step into justifying the way you know that the way you know it is reliable. Um,
Oh
so
yes, yes.
yeah,
So I don't have a justification for that either, right?
yeah,
So
yeah,
right. So the theory would be, to count as knowing, I don't have to justify the proposition. I also don't have to justify the claim that I'm reliable.
right,
Right. I only have to, in fact, be reliable. And
right.
so,
Well,
okay. So, and you can think of like, there are many contexts in which this would be good enough. Like if I'm doing a history test and it says, when was the Battle of Hastings? And I wrote 1066, and that's it. Then the teacher says he knew the answer. Right. And I don't have to give any more. I don't have to say why I think that. Right.
right.
I keep knowing the answer.
Well, I'll tell you, like I'll before I started reading your book, I'll tell you how I kind of thought about knowledge, and this is more scattershot and not very precise because that's sort of what happens before you start thinking about something more deeply. But I just always kind of assumed that our brains have well, I guess I shouldn't say I always did. Since I was educated on this, I would always assume that our brains have neurological patterns that either match some information external to our brain or don't. And those neurological patterns can either be true if they do match something external to my brain, and or not true if in fact they doesn't match anything external to reality or tied to reality. And I never really thought about it more deeply than that. It sounds like that kind of thinking could fit into this idea of having a reliable method of of, of gaining the truth.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
what now? I guess the last thing I'd have to say to that is I always just assumed my knowledge would be probabilistic. Like I would never be able to really know whether the neurons in my head, the pattern of their firing, really matched the outside world.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Well,
yeah,
so I mean we usually we add some. So what you described sounds like true belief, right? Like you're assuming that the patterns in your brain constitute beliefs or something, or anyway, something belief like, right? And they're matching the world. But that's compatible with your just making a lucky guess, right? It could be just like a matter of chance that you just happen to correspond to reality.
yeah,
And then we want to say that's not knowledge. So you have to add something else. Like, maybe you have to add that, well, you had good enough reason, or maybe you have to add just like you're really reliable about this. The way that you form the beliefs reliably gets the truth, right? And then, okay, and then you ask, well, is it always probabilistic? And basically, I think most epistemologists are fallibilists, as we call it, which is to say, we think that knowledge doesn't have to have a probability of one. So you count as knowing things that have probability less than one, and so you could be mistaken, right? In the cases where you are mistaken, you don't in fact know because knowledge has to be true. But there are cases where you know and you're not mistaken, but it's not certain.
right. Yeah,
Okay, and there are pretty strong arguments for thinking that the vast majority of your beliefs are uncertain, including the ones that you might think are certain. So,
yeah.
like,
I
you
worry
think that
about that.
you're certain that there's a hand here, but there's pretty good arguments that that's not certain. So,
Yeah, yeah. I worry about that. And you know what? I think I've worried about it my whole life to some degree. That I think maybe just from watching Twilight Zone or whatever, that you can never really know anything with a probability of one. Um, Now, do you think that that's the case though? That it's impossible to know something with the probability of one, uh, or
yeah,
or I don't know. Do you think it would make more sense maybe to explain skepticism a little more? Because
yeah.
yeah,
Well, so yeah, so what kinds of things could be certain, and like, well, okay, my existence is certain, right? That's certain because I couldn't be mistaken about that. It's a matter of fact, it's logically impossible for me to be mistaken about that because I would have to exist in order to be mistaken about something. So, okay, that's good. And then, like there might be a few other things that are certain, like maybe one equals one. Okay. It's like a very simple necessary truth that you can clearly grasp. Okay. And then maybe beliefs about my present conscious mental states are certain. Okay. But they're pretty strong arguments that contingent claims about the external world are never certain, right? Which I think is basically right. I think it's basically true. And so, you have arguments like, okay, so, you might think that it's certain that I have a hand here, or, at least it should, you probably think that you're certain that you have a hand, right? Because after all, I could be tricking you and holding up a fake hand or something. But anyway, you have a hand. Okay, but like here's an argument. If something is certain, then it's impossible for there to be evidence against it. Okay, and there's a good probabilistic argument for this, all right, from Bayes' theorem. Okay,
yeah,
but it is possible to acquire evidence that you don't really have a hand. So you could describe a possible sequence of events that convinces you that you didn't really have a hand in the first place when you thought you did. And so that shows that it's not completely certain. Okay, right. And another very simple argument is if something is certain, then it's impossible for anything to be more certain. But you're more certain that you exist than that you have a hand. So you're not completely certain that you have a hand.
Right. Yeah. That's an interesting way to compare certainty, eh? I guess I could do that for any belief I have. Like, how far away from I exist is this belief in my in my confidence in it? Um, so okay, so my existence, or in your case, your existence, the certain mathematical truths that just sort of have to be, otherwise it's like you don't, if you think it's not true, maybe you just don't understand it, type of thing. Um, and then I guess where we are then at this point is those might be true, certain, have to be certain, and then anything else is sort of up for grabs. As far as it's probably going to be probabilistic knowledge. So what do we do with that? What's the best way that somebody can try to make sure their probabilistic knowledge is as good as possible?
Yeah. Well, and by the way, like the idea that it's probabilistic. So I think that's true, but it doesn't really matter. Okay.
Okay.
So most of these things that people think are certain are uncertain, but the uncertainty doesn't matter because the probability is very close to 1 or 0.
Right.
So like the probability that you don't have a hand is negligible. It's not literally 0, but it's so close to 0 that it doesn't matter for practical purposes. So yeah. And anyway, and you asked, oh well, how can we make our probabilistic knowledge as good as possible? And like that's a really long and complicated question. I guess the first thing is we'll learn about the kinds of mistakes that people commonly make. Right. This is a thing that I think is neglected because like when we have students take logic or something, and then we teach them the rules of inference, and then we teach them about a list of fallacies. But what we should actually do is study some psychology. What we should actually do is tell them about the heuristics and biases that have been discovered in real human beings that frequently cause them to make mistakes.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was this is only a slight tangent, but was it 3-4 weeks ago? I was reading about a paper out of Poland. There's a longitudinal study on philosophy students to see if 4 years of philosophy training made them better at intuiting novel philosophical problems than a non-philosophy student, or if it just gave them information about basically what other people have said about philosophy. And the study was indicating that actually, like, you'll go into the philosophy program and come out of it with basically the same amount of ability to intuit novel situations. Like you might be as an individual good at philosophy or bad, and you'll probably be good or bad coming out of the program too, depending on how you went in.
Let's see. Wait.
So,
what kind of novel situations are we thinking of?
I don't this is like a month ago that I was reading this thing, but I'll give you an example, right? So like right now, I mean, let's say we finish this conversation and I went and explained to my wife what you told me about epistemology. I'm not really like, I'm thinking about what you told me, but I haven't really invented something or been able to analyze it. But if you just asked me if you gave me a paradox, for example, I'd never seen before, like if I'd never seen Newcomb's paradox or something, and you just handed that to me and asked me to work it out,
Yeah.
after 4 years of studying, I'd be no necessarily better at overcoming my biases,
Yeah.
reasoning improperly than when I went into the program. Now, if you told me what to think about the paradox beforehand, then I'd be able to regurgitate that answer.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm not sure if this is sort of I'm not sure if this is exactly a fair test of like what you get out of philosophy.
It
And
might not be.
I don't know, like you could think of a lot of different kinds of advantages you could get from philosophy, and it's hard to test all of them.
Yeah.
My sense is that okay, so after being in the academy for a few decades, and I've talked to a lot of students, I've talked to other professors, and I've appeared on people's podcasts, and occasionally I have a debate with somebody. Okay, and my sense is that people who have not studied philosophy are very frequently confused and very confused, and especially about philosophical questions. And so, like, if a non-philosopher starts talking about something philosophical, just meaningless nonsense comes out of them, which is like they say they're like contradicting themselves, they're like using words ambiguously, whatever, making category errors and stuff like that. That just happens a lot. I also observe that like a lot of people don't know what an argument is. Like,
Right.
you
Yeah.
know, if you have a debate with somebody and it's a philosopher, they give you an argument and like you can write down the premises and the conclusion of this argument. And if you're talking to a non-philosopher, they don't have an argument. They're just like stream of consciousness talking about their opinion and like restating the opinion and stuff like that. And then when you give an argument, they don't respond to it. You know,
Yep.
they sort of like reiterate their view, but they don't say this premise is false right, at the end of their thing. You don't know which premise they're disputing, if any, and stuff like that. So, you know, that's kind of my experience.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think that um yeah, you're right. I mean, I'm not saying this paper is rock solid proof that nobody will improve their reasoning abilities. And
Yeah.
frankly, if people are going to take anything in university, I think philosophy is a wonderful thing to take. I love the subject, despite the fact that I was not a philosophy student. Um, but I think that for the context of this question and the way this is sort of coming up in my mind is like, okay, we want to make sure we have knowledge. It seems like, or reasonably reliable probabilistic knowledge, if that's what's possible. And it seems like even just studying philosophy in the traditional sense that you were explaining doesn't necessarily get people's guard up about the human biases that you were mentioning prior to that too, right? So I guess I'm sort of agreeing that I think that maybe more time needs to be spent making people aware of their own like, and this is true of every human being, their own cruddy ability to be an unbiased reasoning sort of machine, a rational machine.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, yeah, and
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, you know, there are different kinds of problems, uh, cognitive problems that people face. And so, you know, one of them is confusion. And I think philosophy kind of helps with that. So, but, you know, the other one is just being wrong. So, you know, have the question like, well, do philosophers get to the truth? That's very questionable, right? And, you know,
yeah,
because philosophers usually disagree with each other, they very widely disagree with each other about many things. So it's hard to say that studying philosophy gets you to the truth,
yeah,
right? Because they should agree. um, but it does cause them to be less confused, right? So they have a, you know, it causes you to have a clear false opinion instead of an unclear false.
that's right.
Okay.
Yeah,
But, you know, if you want to avoid being false, being wrong, and like having lots of biases, what do you do? Yeah, like I was suggesting, well, you could look at the kinds of biases people are subject to. The other thought is, you know what, you have to listen to a lot of people that you don't agree with, because I think a big thing is like people have controversial opinions, but they never challenge them. So they never try to find out what a smart critic would say.
yeah.
And so, like, you know, you go through your whole life thinking like X is obviously true, and like there's all these smart people who disagree with it, and you never find out why. And so, you know, and when you read them, like sometimes they will just confront you with your biases.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, not to get into my personal history of things that I've thought are true or false throughout my almost 40 years of being alive, but the most enjoyable, I think, revelations I've had have been from reading people that don't at all think the way that I do naturally. And so, yeah, I can't imagine that anybody will get far without reading what other people would say would refute them. Um, now, I'm wondering on a more like epistemological sense, how if we think that knowledge might, besides the exceptions we've already mentioned, might never be certain, what's the best way that we have? And here I'm thinking just to sort of tip my hat a little about phenomenal conservatism to even start to ground what we might think, and how do we handle that information when we get new information?
Yeah. Yeah, good. Yeah. So you mentioned phenomenal conservatism, which tells you what the starting point is, which is the rational starting point is maybe everything is the way that it seems, right? That is, a rational person starts by assuming that things are the way they appear, unless and until they have reason for doubting that. That's okay. So okay, is there a hand here? I said, well, it's not 100% certain, but it sure looks like there's a hand here. So let's just go with that assumption until there's like something to refute that. Right. And like the evidence for doubting it would have to come from other appearances. Okay. So like if two of your appearances conflict with each other, then you start to think that one of them must be false. But as long as everything is fitting together, you just assume that things are the way they seem.
Yeah, so then that seems eminently pragmatic to me, not necessarily in the technical philosophical sense of pragmatism, but it just seems like what else should you do? Like that I can't think of a more rational, reasonable starting point. But what might does anybody disagree with that, Mike? Like how would somebody say, "No, I think you should assume the opposite, that what you see is total bunk and like this is the reasonable starting point."
Yeah, let's assume everything is an illusion. That might be like the skeptic's starting point. Well, I mean, I think what skeptics would say is, well, you can't start by assuming anything. You have to first have reason to think that appearances are reliable. Why do you think that? And if you don't have any reason for that, then you can't just start by assuming that things are the way they appear. Right. And of course, if that's your starting point, if your starting point is you have to show that appearances are reliable, then that's also your ending point, right? Because you can't show anything. You can't acquire every evidence for anything if you don't get to rely on the way things seem to you.
Yeah.
Right. According to the skeptic, you have to have a reason for thinking that any belief forming method is reliable, but any reason that you would have to be another belief forming method. And then you have to have a reason for thinking that's reliable. So you have an infinite regress. And so, you never get anywhere.
Right. Yeah. It does seem like a problem. I don't know as nobody has ever, do people, you would know this much better than me, because this is probably something that doesn't make it to, popular reading that I'd be more subject to reading. Do people still try to ground skepticism to take it out of that infinite regress, or is that something that philosophers have basically long since given up on? This is just out of my pure curiosity.
Well, I mean, there's been a small number of skeptics, in the history of philosophy who, other philosophers often make fun of, or and like a lot of epistemology is devoted to figuring out what's wrong with skepticism. That's like a big project going back centuries. Okay. So, but there's like a certain small percentage of people when they learn about philosophy become skeptics, and like a very small percentage of them continue to be skeptics for a long time. And so, okay, but so the skeptic would be like, yeah, so as I mentioned, there's this potential infinite regress or circularity problem. So in fact, you can never verify that your cognitive faculties are reliable. You could only use other cognitive faculties, but then you have the regress or the circular. Okay, so actually you can never know anything. And by the way, notice that they're not saying, oh, you can't be 100% certain of anything, right? They'd be rejecting that you have any reason at all for your beliefs. They'd be saying there's no justification. Okay.
Yeah.
And now one problem with this line of reasoning is that it's self-undermining. Because according to this line of reasoning, you have no reason for accepting this line of reasoning.
Right.
Yeah.
That's why I'm wondering, that's what I'm wondering is like, there anybody hanging on to this still? Is there some diehard somewhere still defending defending circularity anyway.
Yeah, I mean, like what do skeptics say when you tell them that they have a self-undermining argument? So that, yeah, periodically a skeptic notices this, and then they just make some bizarre remark that doesn't answer it at all. Or like they'll basically just like embrace that. They'll say, "That's right. We have no justification for accepting this argument either." I didn't say that we had a justification for accepting skepticism. I just said skepticism was true. It's not, you know, we have no justification for believing anything, including that we have no justification for believing anything. Okay, and they're like, okay, that's my position.
It's hard to even imagine what that person does the next day, too.
Right.
Right
And I'm
after.
like, I don't understand how that's supposed to be a response. You didn't.
Yeah.
Like, the other thing that's commonly said is that, well, the skeptics are basically lying, which is to say, nobody in fact believes skepticism, right? So they pose as having this philosophical position, but that is not in fact what they believe. So stop going around saying things that we know you don't believe. You know, why don't just, you know, be honest, say what you actually think. And the way that we know that they don't believe it is that they're constantly relying on the appearances and they're constantly like using beliefs about the external world. And if a truck is coming towards a skeptic, they don't just like, you know, stand there
Yeah.
or wander randomly because they don't trust their senses. They don't do that. They act
No.
like normal people and they rely on the belief that the truck is coming.
Yeah. Exactly. So back to, I guess, normal people, or let's even say ideal people in this case, from a epistemological sense, in that you've got this person who um, observes what things look like, takes it on face value, but also is a bit reserved in that if they get new information, they're going to update their confidence in whatever it is the seeming was. So whether a hand exists, for example, or whatever the case may be. This sounds a lot like Bayesian reasoning. Is there any difference? What does a phenomenal conservatism add to Bayesian reasoning?
So maybe we should say something about Bayesian reasoning.
Yeah, you're probably
Like,
right. Yeah.
um, well, I mean, the Bayesians are people who think that non-deductive reasoning is explained by the laws of probability. All right. And, you know, like there's just like a small number of famous axioms of probability. Okay. And then there's a famous theorem, Bayes' theorem, which is what Bayesianism is named after the Reverend Thomas Bayes. Okay. Which is, okay, so H is some hypothesis and E is some piece of evidence that's relevant to H. Okay. All right. So the theorem says the probability of H given E equals the initial probability of H times the probability of E given H divided by the probability of E. Okay, but in Bayesian reasoning, I take it is it's usually something about it's something like you say there's some evidence that we have that would be more likely to occur if a certain theory were true than if it were not true. And so that means a theory is more likely to be true. Okay, so that kind of inference is what I think is typically described as Bayesian reasoning, because like the legitimacy of that is explained by Bayes' theorem. And now, you know, the biggest problem for, I don't know, a big problem for Bayesians is, okay, so, you know, when I described Bayes' theorem, I mentioned the initial probability of H.
Yeah.
Okay, so like when you figure out how likely something is in the light of some evidence, you have to use the initial probability of it before you got the evidence.
Right.
You take the initial probability and then you multiply it by a certain factor. Where does the initial probability come from?
Well,
And
if I could just, I was sort of picturing, and I'm not saying this is correct. I appreciate the elucidation. I was sort of picturing the initial probability as the seeming, right? It's like I have nothing and then I have a seeming, and I'm not gonna work on justifying that just because it seems that way, and then that's when I'm multiplying against the new information,
yeah,
right?
yeah, good,
That be,
yeah,
yeah. Would that
yeah.
be right?
So yeah, I mean, there are different answers to this thing about the prior probabilities, right? But yeah, but one good answer is, yeah, the prior probabilities just come from the way things strike you initially. So
Right.
you hear a hypothesis and it strikes you as plausible or implausible, and that's what determines your prior probability.
Right.
You know, but there are different answers. You know, like a large class of Bayesians say, you know what, there's no constraints on the prior probabilities, except that you have to be coherent.
I
So
see.
the prior probability, you just pick any number between 0 and 1.
So you're really solving a problem with Bayesian reasoning, with phenomenal conservatism. You're giving a reasonable way to start that, to have that prior.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm at least helping with the problem, I guess.
Yeah.
Because I mean, it doesn't really solve it, because like there are cases where you hear the hypothesis and you just like have no idea,
Right.
right? Like sometimes you hear the hypothesis and it sounds plausible or sounds implausible, but sometimes you're just like, I don't know. And then, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I guess helping is the better way of putting it. Yeah, you've helped, especially in cases where we have everyday experience of certain things, right? And
Yeah.
so not so much if I said like, hey, is the many worlds hypothesis of quantum mechanics true? Actually, that might be a bad example because we don't experience. Oh
Well,
man, I'd have to think of that.
I mean, my initial reaction to it is that it sounds crazy.
Yeah.
So I would have to say it has a low prior for me.
That's right. Yeah, I corrected myself. I think that's a bad example of the type of thing.
But
Um, but
um,
I guess. Well, sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, like an example might be the theory of evolution. So, you see living things, you're like, where did they come from? And then somebody says, I don't know, maybe they evolved by natural selection, blah, blah, blah. What do you think is the likelihood of that? Without any evidence, right? Before we go out and look for the evidence.
Right.
I don't know. I was going to say the other thing that I'm helping with is, well, what is evidence? Right? Because, we're talking about how you update a hypothesis in the light of evidence, but how do you acquire evidence? And obviously Bayes' theorem doesn't tell you how you acquire evidence. It just presupposes that you just got some evidence.
Right.
And so what does that mean? Like, well, what it means to gain evidence is like you had a new appearance. So like, when I think that I got evidence that there was a hand here, what actually happened was that I experienced an appearance of a hand. And so then I greatly increased my credence that there was a hand there. And that counted as acquiring the evidence.
Yeah, that makes sense. So then, if you had another appearance where your hand was gone, you'd have to reconcile the two, right? And
Yeah.
maybe the answer is just that somebody had a mirror that you can, or something obstructing your hand, or maybe the answer is you've lost your hand, or maybe the answer is
Yeah.
you're hallucinating, right? And
Yeah.
then so you'll have to just update your prior based on which of those you think is most reasonable.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, so it sounds like then we have we have an idea of certain things that we can be certain about that we mentioned. We've got an idea about how we can start to reason in the world and update our beliefs. It might not be perfect. It'll never be perfect as far as we know, but it might be optimal for a being like us. Um, what about different? Are there different types of knowledge? And like, so for here, for example, I'm thinking about like moral knowledge, which you've done a lot of work in, right? Like, is that, and I don't even really know if I could explain what I mean by different types other than by giving examples. But is moral knowledge, what's right and wrong, different in kind than the knowledge that gravity is pulling on me right now to the Earth's, center of
Yeah.
gravity?
Well, like is A different in kind from B always depends on what kinds you're talking.
Sure.
So yes, because moral knowledge is moral and the knowledge of gravity is non-moral. So, okay. And then, another difference is, well, one of them is empirical and the other one is a priori, right? And by empirical, I mean, the thing about gravity rests on observations with the five senses, like literally seeing, you literally see stuff falling and then you time it, stuff like that. And you don't literally see moral value. Okay, so like, somebody performed an action and you thought it was wrong. You didn't literally see that it was wrong with your eyes, but you could have seen that it was wrong with your mind, like in the sense that you thought about it and it seemed wrong to you. So, like that's a difference. Of course, there are similarities, among any two kinds of knowledge because they're knowledge, right? So like they're
Yeah.
justified beliefs, in both
Well,
cases.
let me yeah, fair enough. I agree with everything you just said. So let me try to make the question, let me try to fix it a little bit. Are we going to apply the same framework to moral knowledge as we would to that more physical type of knowledge? So here I mean like if I see something with my eyes is dropping, and then my mind comes up with this idea about gravity, and then I can work with that information. Is this the framework for I see something happen and my brain comes up with this idea or something? I intuit this idea that it was wrong ethically. Um, I could, I suppose, get defeaters for that intuition. Would I be updating
Yeah.
that information the same way as physical
Yeah.
information?
Yeah. I mean, they're the same in this way that, well, in any case of trying to acquire knowledge, you should start by assuming that things are the way they seem. Right. So, you think, oh, well, okay, how do I know that anything is morally right or wrong? Well, there's some actions that when you think about them, they seem wrong. Okay. So, like, you saw a baby and the baby was crying. And so you were annoyed. So you just go over and like beat up the baby. Okay.
You've been watching me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. I have a hidden camera.
yeah, yeah.
So, that seems wrong. Okay. And so, you know what? I'm going to go with the assumption that it was wrong, unless like I can come up, unless somebody comes up with some great argument that it wasn't wrong. Okay. But, for now, provisionally, let's assume that that was wrong. Okay. And then you might think, oh, but, you can't prove that your appearances are reliable. Okay. So, well, if I have to prove that, then I'm never going to know anything about morality. But if I get to start by assuming things are the way they seem, then I can know lots of things. Okay. And then, the point is, well, that's exactly parallel to every area of knowledge. And so, there are these moral skeptics who think, oh, because of this, we can never know anything about morality. Right. But that argument is exactly parallel to the skeptic's argument that you can't know anything about physical reality. So, like I see a hand here and it looks to me like a hand. So I'm just going to assume that that's what it is, unless I have reason for thinking otherwise. And then, a skeptic can come forward and say, well, you have to prove that the senses are reliable. Right. And then I can't do that without using the senses. So I'm never going to succeed. So then I would never know anything about physical reality. Right. It looks like exactly parallel arguments. So if you don't buy the skeptic's argument about the physical world, then the argument doesn't work about morality either.
Yeah, and this is one reason why that, not about morality in particular, but when I explained at the start of this that I always was sort of under the impression that any knowledge might be probabilistic in nature. And we can just discount the examples you gave about knowledge of your own existence, for example. But it's this incompleteness theorem, right? It's this idea that if you're in a coherent logical system, then there's always going to be you're never going to find a fact in that system that justifies itself, that justifies the system. I mean, what is it, Gödel's incompleteness, right? So it just seems like there's a logical impossibility as human beings to have any area of knowledge where you're going to finally ground it to that one thing that everything sprouts from there. And I don't know if you would disagree with that. I mean, or if maybe just if you would disagree with parts of it, or
yeah. Well, yeah. So since you mentioned Gödel's theorem, Gödel had a couple of theorems that are famous and that are often repeated. So one of them is the incompleteness of arithmetic. Is if you have a formal logical system that is at least sophisticated enough to represent arithmetic on the natural numbers, then it's either inconsistent or it's incomplete.
Yeah.
And inconsistent meaning that you can prove, two contradictory things. And incomplete meaning there are truths that can't be proven using the system.
Yeah.
Okay. And then like people often try to draw some amazing philosophical lessons from this. And it is an amazing and very interesting theorem, but it's a theorem about formal systems. It's not a theorem about people. So like it doesn't obviously immediately have any implications about what people can know or can't know. Like we're not formal systems. Although, some people maybe think that we are formal systems. Okay. So then
yeah. I think I might think that, Mike.
yeah. And anyway, and then the other famous theorem is that, well, you can't use a formal system to prove the to prove the consistency of that same system.
Right.
And so, okay, so like you need a more powerful system to prove that something is consistent. So you're like, like you have propositional logic and you want to prove that it's consistent. So you have to use some reasoning that's more sophisticated than the reasoning of propositional logic.
Right.
Okay. And so, you're like, oh, well, can we prove that our own thinking is consistent? Well, if you think that human thinking is a formal system, then that theorem is relevant. And then that would mean that we can't prove that we're consistent. Although, maybe we don't need to prove it. Maybe we can just like have a justified belief, right?
Well,
Without a proof.
I guess I was thinking more so not that human beings rigidly conform to a formal system in their thinking, because certainly human beings can contradict themselves and end up in that sort of situation where they can prove anything uh, through like because they're contradictory. But I was thinking more so that human beings might be stuck in a formal system, even if the human's capable of being wrong. It might not be possible for the human to reach that sort of more powerful system that might have given rise to the system they're stuck in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so I believe that people have free will. So,
Yeah.
um, so that's a way that we're not modeled by a formal system. Okay, but for practical purposes, there certainly are cases where somebody's stuck in a mistake. Like a person has a false belief and you just cannot talk them out of it. Like you give them evidence and then they just like try to rationalize away the evidence. Like that happens sometimes. I mean, the reason for that probably is not that they have a defective formal system, right? The explanation is more psychological, like they have some kind of emotional attachment to this belief or something like this.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. That's going to be the case with so, and to be perfectly clear, I don't think humans have free will necessarily, depending on how that's defined. And I think we'd have to sort of push the rest of the conversation aside a little bit to figure out whether we agree on that. But I was more so thinking that like I can't picture, and if you can, I would love this. Like I'd like to hear this. I can't picture a human superseding Aristotelian logic, for example, like with some new set of logic that explains Aristotelian logic, right?
Oh, I
Like,
mean, it's widely thought that Gottlob Frege superseded Aristotelian logic, right?
did he? Yeah.
But not in the sense of like refuting the axioms, but in the sense of giving a larger, more powerful system.
Right. Okay.
Okay, because like there are some valid deductive inferences that are not explained using the Aristotelian rules, but can be explained in predicate logic.
Oh, interesting.
Okay, but okay, so like an example that somebody gave me when I was in graduate school was okay, premise: all horses are animals. Conclusion: all heads of horses are heads of animals.
Right.
All horse heads are animal heads.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's not hard to represent that in predicate logic. But it's hard to turn that into an Aristotelian syllogism.
Interesting. Okay, so more fundamentally, I was thinking more like it just the law of identity, A equals A, right?
Yeah.
Or even the sort of corollary to that A does not equal not A, right? Like it's sort of it's sort of
everything is self-identical.
yeah, it's sort of hard for me. Like that just seems true to me. I intuit that that's true. I've never seen an example where that's not true. I can't even imagine what an example would look like where
You
that's
haven't
not
seen a
true.
thing that's not itself, huh?
I haven't. Yeah, all my years, Mike.
Not what it is. Yeah.
So I start to think like, well, maybe that is just, I mean, that even sort of explains scarcity in economics. It sort of explains the conservation of information in physics. It's sort of the same effect, right? Like
yeah. Well,
it's
I mean, there's some question about like how much could be explained by a tautology, right? Like it's a little bit weird if a tautology explains, empirical observations. But okay, so I think now I understood what you were saying. Like you mean that we can't supersede classical logic? That's what logicians today would say.
Yeah, so, exactly. Yeah, I just don't. Exactly. Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, because like Frege's system counts as classical logic. Okay. It's more powerful than Aristotelian, but okay. So like the law of non-contradiction, you can't have both A and not A, and the law of excluded middle, either A or not A must be the case, right? And there are attempts to get past to get past that. Like
Yeah.
there are alternative logics in which those things don't hold. And I think those axioms are like obvious necessary truths. And basically, I think the alternative logics are they're sort of, I don't know, changing the way we use words or something. They're not
Yeah.
really. You can't really come up with a case where a contradiction is true.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I
And like,
agree. Yeah.
and when you're reasoning about what the alternative logic system should say, I think you're using classical logic in your thinking about the system. That just automatically happens.
Exactly. That's exactly, yeah, we're on the same page now. It's hard for me. So that is like a base thing that I just can't even imagine what it would be like if that's not true. And I don't think I can ever explain it. Like I can't ever really justify it. It's just I can't think of something that a system that would be outside of that would explain why that is where in our
Oh, yeah.
universe. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I feel like that's just never going to be accessible to a being like me,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
I'm inside that system. So
Well, I would say the reason isn't that you're inside the system. The reason is that it doesn't make any sense for there to be. So, like, a true contradiction that just doesn't make any sense and is impossible, and that's why you can never grasp it because there isn't anything to grasp.
right.
But I mean, in one of my other books in Paradox Lost, I explained the law of non-contradiction insofar as you can explain it. And what the explanation is, well, you have to understand the way we use the word not when you say not a. Okay, so there's a set of possible worlds, or there's a set of possible ways that the world could have been, and there's a range within that set that's the possibilities that make a true, whatever a is. It doesn't matter what a is. There's some subset of all the possibilities that make a true, and not a is simply defined as all of the other possibilities.
Right.
And so if you think that you found a possibility where both a and not a obtain, then you're confused, because by definition, just by the meaning of the word not, if a is true in some possibility, then not a isn't.
Yeah.
Right. And similarly for the law of excluded middle, if you thought that you came up with a possible case in which neither a nor not a holds, then you're confused about how we use the word not. Because in that possibility, since a doesn't hold, not a automatically does hold, because we're just stipulating that that's how we use the word not.
So I guess okay, so here's where my mind goes. Like, again, I don't really disagree with anything you just said. I think I just
Yeah.
have a different way of picturing this, which is okay, it's conceivable. I can imagine, you know how physicists will sometimes try to invent a universe to see if it's self-consistent, and then they'll take that universe and design an experiment to find out if that's our universe, that sort of thing. So it's conceivable to me a being that thinks of A equals A, um, and then like goes and checks to see if that's the case. Um, and in our instance here, that in this universe, it absolutely seems to be the case. Like I can't imagine again. I can't imagine what it would mean to not be the case. But then I start to wonder if maybe the reason I can't imagine it is because I'm in it. You know what I mean? Like maybe there are other things I could think of if I wasn't in A equals A universe.
Oh, well,
You know,
I
like
mean,
it's
yeah. I mean, this would make sense if a equals a was not a tautology, right?
yeah,
So, I mean, it's sort of like somebody asks, why can I not imagine a married bachelor? Maybe it's just my cognitive limitations because I happen to be trapped in the universe in which bachelors are unmarried.
yeah.
No, it's like there can't be a married bachelor because bachelor just means unmarried man. And so it's like, that's like how there's no a not equal to a world, right? Just because of that meaning of equals, right? Or the meaning of is.
Yeah, I guess the way that it's different is that the physicist could write down, like I said, I stipulated a universe that isn't contradictory, that we can still imagine, and then we're
Yeah,
just
yeah.
not sure if this is the right one. So they have a disanalogy there, right? Yeah, okay. So
I mean, like what I want to say is like
yeah,
it's possible to form a sequence of words that doesn't refer to anything, and then you can get confused using that sequence of words as if it referred to something. Because you can have a sequence of words like it sounds like it should refer to something because it's like a, grammatically correct or something, but it doesn't.
yeah,
Okay, so like round square. Think about the round square. Okay, like why can't God create a round square? You're limiting God's power. You say that he can't create a round square. Well, no, like the phrase round square doesn't refer to anything.
yeah.
It's just two words, but their meanings are incompatible. So like it's not like there's something, that we're failing to imagine.
Right. So okay, so here's a question about that then that directly relates to a few pages anyway of understanding knowledge, right? And that's Moore's paradox, right? So I might mess this up a little bit, but I think the sentence is it's raining outside, but I don't know that it's raining. Is that the
Yeah, there's a series of related ones. Yeah, like it's
okay?
raining, but I don't believe that it is, and it's
Yeah.
raining, but I don't know if it's raining,
Okay.
and yeah,
So
it's
that's
raining, but I
it's
have no reason to think so.
it's grammatically correct, but is this an
Yeah.
example of then just a phrase that's not really pointing
Oh,
to a condition that can exist in the real world?
oh, no. See, that is possible. Like the
Yeah.
reason why it's a paradox, it's not a paradox, okay, but
No.
people call it Moore's paradox anyway.
Yeah.
It's a mildly puzzling puzzle, right? So okay, the Moore's mild puzzle, which doesn't sound as good, is like all of those sentences actually do refer to a possible state of the world, but they sound contradictory or something like that. So, okay, it's raining, but I don't believe that it is. Well, there's a possible state of affairs in which it's raining, and Mike Huemer doesn't believe that it's raining. That's not an impossible state, right? Okay, but when I assert that that's the situation, it sounds to people like I'm contradicting myself or something like that. So then the puzzle is to explain why it sounds contradictory, even though it's possible.
So the interpretation where you say uh it's raining outside, but I don't believe or know whatever that it's raining. That does sound contradictory if the person hearing the sentence assumes that you you have 100% knowledge that it is raining outside, but you also don't know that it's raining outside. So
Yeah.
in that
But
interpretation of the sentence, I do kind of think it's pointing at nothing,
yeah.
no
Well, yeah.
actual condition that could exist, right?
Yeah, yeah. But see, I didn't say I knew that it was raining. I just said it
Right.
was.
Yeah.
So
No, fair enough. That fixes it for
so
sure. But yeah.
So, I
Yeah.
mean, Moore's explanation was that when you make an assertion, you're implying that you know the content of the assertion. You're not saying that you know it, but you're implying it. Like in something like the way if I say, "Have you stopped beating your wife?" then I'm implying that you were beating your wife. I didn't actually say it, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, so then the explanation is it sounds contradictory because you're implying something in the first half of the sentence, which you're explicitly denying in the second half of the sentence.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So I think that solves Moore's paradox then, Moore's minor puzzle. Um,
Yeah.
I can I can think of one other area I really want to ask you about. Um, although I'd really like to ask you more about free will. I don't think we're going to have time. I think that's a whole other.
Oh yeah.
I have a lot more thoughts on free will than I do on epistemology, but direct and indirect realism. I think maybe we'll have a discussion about this, and
Yeah.
that'll be a good summary of epistemology, unless you can think of something else that we should cover. Um, I was actually confused in reading your book about whether you thought direct realism, which to me means that there's nothing mediating the outside world and your experience of it. And happy to be corrected on a definition you like more. An indirect realism where there's something mediating outside world and your experience of it subjectively. I'm not sure which one you think, because I know you have a lot of I I know that scientific reasoning, while not necessarily the primary way you want to reason about everything, has truck with you. I mean, I know if I show you a study about something, you're going to take it into account. You may believe it, you might not, but you're gonna that might sway you. But also, if I give you a purely logical argument about something, that might sway you too. And I sort of in your writing see things where it seems to me like you think we experience direct realism, and then other things where you think we experience like an indirect realism, and I'm just not sure where you fall on it. So I was hoping you could clarify any of that mess that I just said.
Uh, okay, well, now I'm wondering about what are the parts where I sounded like an indirect realist.
I didn't write the page number down, but I could
Okay,
send it to you.
well,
Yeah.
um, I mean, I guess like we have to define these terms more clearly, and like okay, I'm not a big lover of definitions, but I think
Oh
there's like
God.
a whole lot of confusion about what those words mean. Okay,
Yeah.
so like the direct realist view is not the view that um, it's not the view that there are no causal steps in between something happening in the external world and your forming knowledge about it. Like, it's not like direct realists are not denying that brain processes occur or anything like
Right.
that. They're not denying that, light waves come from the object or whatever. um, okay, but so there's a couple of I don't know, a couple of related theses. All right. So like one of the issues is when you perceive an object, are you aware of the object by being aware of something else? So there's something in the external physical world, and then you have some experience, and you think that you're aware of the object. Okay, so the indirect realists think, well, yeah, you're kind of aware of the object, but you're only aware of the object indirectly, meaning you're aware of the object by being aware of another object. So okay, so like there's the cup here, and I'm aware of the object because I'm aware of a mental image of the object in my mind, which represents the physical cup.
Right.
And then, okay, and then you're like, well, how did I know there was a real cup if I'm only really perceiving the object? And then you have like these skeptical worries. Okay, so there's the closely related thesis that your justification for believing in stuff about the external world has to be inferential. So because you're only directly aware of the mental images, you have to make an inference from the mental images to the external object. So like that's all the kind of a pretty standard indirect realist view. Then the direct realist view is no, I'm aware of the cup, and I'm not aware of the mental image of the cup. I'm just aware of the cup. Right. And
Right.
so I don't have to infer that there's a cup. I get to start by assuming that there's a cup unless there's reason to think otherwise. Right, did that help? So
Uh,
so direct realism fits with phenomenal conservatism as far as I understand.
okay. So this is me, I'm sure, Mike, but I'm still confused. So let's see if I can figure this out within the next few minutes. So phenomenal conservatism, something seems to be the case, and I'm going to take that at face value until there's a defeater. Why does it matter if you think I'm getting the data inferentially or directly?
Oh, what does it matter? I mean, I guess if it's inferential, then we have to explain the inference, and that has proved pretty difficult.
Okay,
So,
so there's the cup. Photons go into my eyes. I know everybody accepts that brain processes are occurring. Um, Now, if I think, and I'm gonna just sit in an agnostic position about any of this, but just like if I think my brain is producing a mental image that I become aware of, I guess that's the inferential case where I'm inferring something's there because my brain is producing this image, right? But I would still rely on that seeming because I don't have another choice, do I? I mean,
yeah,
eh,
well, I mean, I guess you could be a skeptic or an idealist or something.
I
This
guess, yeah,
okay, so like this, so this was David Hume's view, right? So there's this discussion where he says, imagine that you're looking at a table and you move away from the table, and as he puts it, the table that you see gets smaller or seems to diminish in size, but the real table does not alter. So therefore, that shows that what you were seeing wasn't the real table, but just the image of the table in your mind. Okay, and then, all right, but then there's this stuff, there's like this skeptical argument, what exactly he's trying to accomplish is matter for debate. But anyway, there's like, there appears to be a skeptical argument where he says, okay, you can't actually infer anything about the physical world, even probabilistically from premises about your images. Because in order to make the inference, it's something like this, that you would have to know that there was a correlation between these mental properties and these physical properties. It's all you ever observe is the mental properties, and you're trying to infer the physical properties, but you'd have to know what things the mental properties were correlated with. But you can't know that because you only ever see one side of this correlation. Right? You only ever see the mental things, you never see the physical things, so you have no way of confirming that they're actually correlated.
I don't know if it's as much of a worry though, just because like we already accept that there are many things that we just can't know with 100% probability, but it might be all the way up there at 99.9% probability, right? And so I start to think about like illusions, the one where it looks like a duck and then a rabbit and then a duck, depending on the way your mind is interpreting the image. And I'm going, well, something has to be sort of presenting this to me, right?
But I mean that, like this, the skeptical claim is, it's not that you can't be certain of the facts about the external world, it's that you have no reason at all for thinking anything about the external world. So because you don't, it's not like you can make a probabilistic argument. You can't make a probabilistic argument because you've only ever seen one term. You're thinking that two things are correlated, you've only ever seen one term, so it's just a complete guess what might be going on in the external world.
But there's a whole, I know you don't believe that either. It's just that, but to me there's a, I think I naturally tend towards some kind of indirect realism because of my psychology background, where I do think about things like the ways that the brain can be tricked into presenting information to, I'm going to say whatever I am, that's understanding that presentation. But it just seems to me that there's so many bits of information we have that would explain why we're getting that picture in our mind and how that evolved. And you could always be a skeptic about almost anything, and I get that, but it doesn't worry me too much. It's more like sorry.
I mean, the direct realist point in bringing up skepticism is, we have a good answer. like direct realism avoids skepticism. You don't want to be a skeptic, come over to our side.
I guess I don't know.
Because we don't have to explain how you make this inference and what the logic is supposed to be. Right. And so among indirect realists, I think that the most common thing to say is that there's an inference to the best explanation. Right. It's not a pure inductive inference. It's something like, well, the best explanation for why I have certain mental images and why there's some regularities in the mental images is that they're caused by something external to me. Right. Okay. And now what's wrong with that? So actually, I think that's pretty reasonable. Okay. But what the skeptic would say is, well, there's alternative explanations for your experiences. Like you could be a brain in a vat, right? Or maybe like there could be a deceiving God who's planting images in your mind and stuff like that. And
I'm more worried about our own minds interpreting things in different ways, right? Like if something goes haywire with a portion of our central nervous system, that could happen internally and not externally, and then I start to worry about like I don't know. I think maybe everything presented to me is sort of a reconstruction of what's actually out there.
Well, so they were like real world, those skeptical scenarios are not real things that happen, but there were real things like people have hallucinations, like schizophrenics or something, hear voices talking to them and so on. Okay. And then like there's supposed to be an argument that refutes direct realism, but it's really, really not clear how that argument's supposed to go. Okay. So if you're a schizophrenic and like you're hallucinating voices, then you're not directly aware of the physical world in those particular experiences. No, so what? That doesn't prove that you're not aware of the real world when you're perceiving things normally.
No, but wouldn't it? I guess. Look, I'm not saying this is a good argument. I guess the intuition would be there if something is affecting the way um, that you're seeing the world, then there's a pathway in your brain that can be affected internally, right? So then wouldn't it stand to reason that what your brain is doing is a reconstruction of the world the best it can, and sometimes it gets it wrong, right? But that
Um,
doesn't
well,
seem to me to be like a direct realism. Something like how does that? I don't know how that fits into direct realism. I'd have to think about that more.
yeah, well, I mean, I guess we have to clarify like what we're talking about.
I guess
So,
so. Yeah,
I
maybe.
mean,
Yeah.
like there's a certain amount of non-conscious processing that occurs in your brain, and
Yes.
that non-conscious processing results in what? Okay, and one description is, well, there's a certain amount of processing that has to be done for you to be aware of the physical world. And then the other description is this processing goes to construct a mental image for you to be aware of. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So like, the first description is better.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so
So, yeah, like I know I don't want to make it seem like you're denying physical processes happen in the brain because I know you're not. I just um, I don't understand how the physical process would happen in the brain, um, how it would affect the image of the outside world that's presented to you if it was not the case that it was building some kind of reconstruction or simulation in your own head or interpreting that
well,
data that comes in,
yeah,
I,
it's not creating a simulation in your head, because if it was doing that, then somebody would have to be observing that simulation. And then
I think it kind
and
of
then
works
there'd
that
have to be
way.
like another agent in your head that was looking at the simulation.
I think I think it
But
might kind
no,
of work
there's
that
only
way.
one agent. Um,
Yeah. Oh man, I don't
uh,
know. I don't know if I
but
agree with that.
well, okay. Usually, when I mention the homunculus, people immediately reject them, reject that there's a homunculus. So anyway, um, so like the question is something like, well, what is the object of awareness? Okay, so like, well, you have to do a certain amount of brain processing in order to accurately represent the world. Okay, and then sometimes it could go wrong and you could be misrepresenting the world. But in either case, it's the world that you're representing. You're not representing some mental object. Right? And then okay, and then like if you want to hear some arguments for why there is not a mental object, right? You're like, okay, so where would the mental object be? Right. So like, there's the cup, and we know where this is in physical space. And then somebody tells you that, well, there's like a cup-like object in your mind that your brain recreated. And like, where is that? If you cut open somebody's head, can you find the little tiny cup in there? And
I
then,
don't. So yeah, I know what you mean. I don't. So obviously, I don't think there's like physically a recreation of a cup in my head, right? It's more like I'm picturing it. I'm more picturing it like just a firing of neurons that are noticed by other neurons, and those neurons are presenting an image, not something physical, uh, in the person's head. And I actually, I mean, I'd have to say so much more about consciousness that we don't. There's no way to get into it right now, but
yeah.
I sort of see it like be a good example. I don't know. I might not pull this off, but picture an old vinyl record, right? So it's got its grooves. Those grooves are in some way going to correlate to the wave of the audio signal that it was picking up. Piece of electromagnetic whatever made something go up and down to groove that pattern into the vinyl, and then when it's played back, we're going to hear a representation of the original audio wave that went into that vinyl. And I sort of feel like we're hearing that representation, and like a part of us is hearing that representation, and another part of us in a different cortex is sort of being the vinyl that's getting cut to the specifications of the outside world.
Yeah.
I guess that'd be the
Well,
on the closest thing I could think of to simply putting like how I sort of view this going. I don't know.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, okay. So like originally there was like some musical instruments that were making the sound, and then there's like, we created this vinyl record with little bumps in it that, okay, that sort of corresponds to the sounds that were originally made. Okay, and then there's the sounds that come out when you play the record and the person is hearing that. But so there's two separate sound sources in this story. There's the original, okay,
Yeah.
the original music, and then there's the vinyl record. But and then like you're sort of introducing a third thing, which is the thing that's only in your brain that you're hearing. But like the thought is, well, why do you need that? like um
Yeah.
if you're going to hear, I guess, I don't know, you think about it like this, like somebody says that we're always hearing records and not real things. Then you'd be like, well, that doesn't solve any problem, because if you could hear the record, then you should be able to hear the original sounds also.
I guess to complete it though, it's like the record will not be perfect, right? There's going to be some loss of signal. It might get dirty. There might be a problem with the needle. And then when it's played back and you're observing it again, which I do think at least in my experience, I do think the brain works a little bit that way. You're recreating something that may or may not represent the exterior world at a certain time, right?
Yeah.
And so that's when this is where I really struggle with direct realism and indirect realism, and whether I often just think it doesn't really matter at the end of the day, because I agree with phenomenal conservatism in that, like, well, how it seems to me is how I should take it until I've got a reason
Yeah.
to not take
Well,
it that way. But
and when I have perceptual experiences, the way it seems to me is that there's stuff in the external world. The way it seems to me isn't that there's stuff in my mind.
right,
Right. So like in a normal experience, it seems to me like there's a cup in front of me. It doesn't seem to me like there's a mental image of a cup.
yeah, that's
And
interesting.
the supposed mental object, like its only function is to make it seem to you like there's a real object.
Yeah, I mean that would be the purpose of the mental object. Yeah, I just don't know if there's another way of when there's a record, the record becomes meaningful when someone observes it. Otherwise, it's not really doing anything. It's just sort of there. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, and you know what? This it strikes me too that like, and this is something I want to get in deeper into in later episodes of this podcast is people don't all think the same way, right? Some people don't have internal monologues. Some people don't internally visualize, and other people do. And I wonder, like, if it's easier to
Yeah.
accept one premise or the other, depending on how your own brain works, or what your own
Yeah.
lived experience is. But
Well, I mean, so like there's a fairly widely accepted idea in philosophy of perception that is referred to as the transparency of experience, which is that when you have a sensory experience of something and you try to examine the characteristics of your experience, you really just examine the characteristics of the object. So, like, if I want to try to, I want to reflect on how something looks to me, I just look at the object, I don't have independent awareness of the experience of the object. Like I want to, and somebody asked me, does it look green to you? I look at the object and then I see whether it's green. If
right.
it seems green to me, then I say my experience represents it as green. I don't have an independent
See,
access to the experience.
that's an interesting example, though, Mike, because okay, this is just a very short story about something that happened to my family on one Christmas where somebody was wearing a sweater and everyone was arguing about whether it was brown. I think it was whether it was brown or red. I could be getting it wrong, but it's some closely related
Yeah.
colors. Everyone had a different opinion. Obviously, everybody's getting the same photons in their eyes. Um, not everybody has the same eyes. I have blue eyes. Other people in my family have brown eyes. I don't know if that would affect it or not, right? But like it, so what we had to do finally was get out a color wheel and see, which one which one matched the closest. And
Yeah.
everybody could sort of agree on what matched, but nobody could agree
Oh,
on like whether initially it was red or green or sorry, brown. And
okay.
I wonder if that like why is that? Is that
Did it?
is it because our brain is interpreting it differently, or is it?
Oh, did you come to an agreement at the end?
Yeah, we all agreed I was right at the end. No,
Oh,
I'm just
good.
no, we all yeah, we did. We got the color wheel out and put it up to the sweater and figured out what like the color wheel thought basically that it
Uh,
was.
hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, a couple of things that go on is you sort of have um mechanisms in your brain that make adjustments for conditions that are, you know, for like what your brain mechanisms take to be conditions that are possibly distorting the appearance, right? So like, in different lighting conditions, a different spectrum of photons comes to your eyes, and like the evolutionarily designed mechanisms want to detect the intrinsic characteristics, or I don't know if it's intrinsic, but anyway, they want to
Yeah.
detect the physical characteristics that are in the surface of the object. And so like there's some kind of adjustment for the lighting conditions. And then, and that adjustment could be complicated and could depend upon subtle cues in the environment. And so it's possible that, somebody's brain is making an adjustment, as if there were different lighting conditions. And then another person's brain is not succeeding. Okay,
Yeah.
but another thing that could be happening is, well, you could have just drawn conceptual boundaries in different places.
Yeah.
So you could in fact be seeing it the same way, but you just like, there's the boundary of red and brown, and you just like put it in a slightly different place than somebody else put that boundary. So it wouldn't really be a substantive disagreement.
Yeah, no, there are definitely alternative explanations to our brain gets the information and then has to reconstruct what it's seeing in a way that it presents to us. And yeah, I agree. Everything you just named is possible. So I'm not saying it, yeah, it's definitely not a rock solid argument for indirect realism. Um, but I do think I still think it's possible, though, that my explanation might be the reason
Yeah,
that it's being reinterpreted in different ways to different
yeah,
people. But well,
yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, I sort of like, um, I'm usually unsure whether the indirect realists are, well, if you have indirect realists who are not philosophers, I'm unsure of whether they're actually saying the thing that the philosophers are saying, right?
I'm not sure either. I started this
Because
whole conversation off with saying I was confused about it, and that's I think the thing I was most confused about in the book. Uh,
yeah, because
yeah,
okay, so like, it's, well, it's widely agreed that when you perceive things normally, you have an experience of the object, and the experience of the object is not the physical object; it's an experience of the object. Okay, but like in the history of philosophy, the indirect realists are usually saying, and what you're aware of is something that's mind dependent. Okay, and then the direct realists they're not saying that there isn't a mental state. They're saying that what you're aware of is the physical state, and the role of the mental state is to make you aware of the physical state. So like your awareness of the physical thing is partly constituted by your just having this mental state. The mental state isn't the object of awareness, if you see what I mean. Okay, and so like all of the cases where there's like illusion or hallucination, these can all be explained. Like none of these is really a problem for the direct realist. Okay, so you can have you could have a mental state that misrepresents the world, in which case you don't count as being aware of a real thing. But that doesn't show that you're not aware of a real thing in the cases where you're correctly representing the world. Okay, and then you could have a misrepresentation where you're only misrepresenting some features of it, but you still count as being aware of the object. Okay, but that doesn't require you to be aware of a mental object. Really.
so yeah, I see what you're saying. I start to wonder whether an unconscious thing could be aware of an external object, and I think it probably could be it could have a state that would be very similar or the same as having a mental state of being aware of something. Um,
Oh, like, can you be unconsciously aware of something? Well, I mean, I guess I think that in order to have unconscious mental states, you have to have conscious mental states. Like you have to be a conscious being in order to have unconscious mental states. And why would I say that? I don't know. Like I kind of think
uh,
that unconscious mental states are, they have something to do with dispositions to have conscious mental states in the right conditions. like when you have an unconscious belief, that has something to do with the conscious belief that you would have if you were appropriately prompted.
Yeah.
And so, like, if there's a being that's just completely non-conscious, then they think it doesn't have any mental states.
I'm going to have to think a lot more about this, and I think I'm going to use this as inspiration actually for, um, yeah, I want to think a lot more about this because I see what you're saying. I want to listen back on this and carefully consider. Here's the thing about you, Mike, is, and I really mean this. You have an example in your book, Understanding Knowledge. It sort of reminded me of a Star Trek episode, actually, where you're like, if you do this mathematical, I think it was a simple multiplication of numbers, and you come to an answer and you're sure about that answer, and then you put it into a computer and it gives you a different answer, you really should stop to like consider whether you're right because a computer is highly reliable. And the Star Trek episode it reminds me of is there's an episode of the original series where Mr. Spock deduces that the Enterprise computer is not working properly because he can beat it in chess. And
Yeah.
this and therefore Captain Kirk is innocent, right? And I often use you as that sort of I don't know if this is the right word, the barometer of like, is what I'm thinking reasonable? And then I'm gonna go look to see what you think about it because it's always worth considering, honestly. So anybody watching this, like if I really think if you want somebody to honestly challenge you, I think Mike's stuff is worth reading. And you have so many books about, you've got Knowledge, Reality, and Value, which is similar. It's not entirely about epistemology, but there it is.
Everybody should buy that.
I agree. Everybody should buy all of these, and I mean it. So you've got your Paradox book. I think Paradox Lost, is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, do I have that? Where's that? That's also good. I mean, yeah, I have like 10 books or something. So, you know,
I'm not gonna read. Yeah, I'm not gonna mention all of them, but
you
and
can't buy all of them at once, but you know,
yeah, I think I've been buying them over the course of a few years. But one that I thought was excellent also, and it's a departure from the rest of them, is the dialogues on ethical veganism is excellent. I think anybody
yeah,
should pick that
yeah,
up.
that's right. It's true. So that
It's
you
an
can, you know, modify your eating habits,
yeah,
hopefully.
or at least be aware that your unmodified ones are wrong, and you can maybe over time that will nudge you to make other choices. But it's an accessible book. It's super well written and very logical. I really enjoyed it. And then there's your Substack, right? Of I actually I've wondered. So I know it's fake new, fake.
Fake
But
news.
do you pronounce the S? You do, eh?
Yeah. Fakenous.
Yeah.
Um, Nous is the Greek word for mind or something like that.
Okay. So
So, and so there's a journal, there's a like prominent philosophy journal called Nous, and right, and then there's a philosophy blog called the Daily Nous.
yes, I knew. Yeah, I know that.
Okay,
So
so
I'd
yeah,
always pictured it because I have half my family is French Canadian, and you know NOUS is new. You don't say the
the
S,
French word.
and it means us.
Us, yeah,
Yeah. So the fake us, I always
yeah.
sort of pictured, but I knew what you're going for, but I always wondered. I thought I'm probably saying this wrong every time. So people can look you up there. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention about stuff you're doing, stuff you've done that people should?
No, not really. Just
That's
you know,
enough.
my blog is good,
It
and my
is.
books are good.
Okay. Well, on that positive note, I'm going to then say thanks, Mike, for joining me on this, and we'll catch everybody else again soon.
All right, thanks. Great talking to you.